It was announced that Ropes and Gray, which is a fairly prominent firm, has set the day for people to come back. And reading the story, it didn't suggest to me that it was an optional day to come back. It sort of sounded like this is the day that we will come back, and we all need to be back, and we all need to be in the office, and by God, we're going to do it. And it sort of set me to thinking, particularly after I was reading Victoria's piece about court systems and what they're doing. We've had a lot of talk about this is really the inflection point for legal tech and innovation. And, now that we've seen how wonderful it is to work from home in our pajamas with our cats running around and all that jazz, we'll never want to go back. And, I sort of wonder what's going to happen, whether law firm leadership is going to say, as many of them seem to believe, that we really need to have everybody in the office come hell or high water. And, we are not too interested in remote work and all that. I don't know. As I say, in reading Victoria's piece, I sort of wondered the same with courts. We started out, it looked like the virtual online court idea was really getting traction, and courts were enthusiastic, litigants were enthusiastic, clients that pay the bills were enthusiastic. But when you sit down and ask yourself today, if we could go back, if we can go to ILTA and it's safe, if we can go back to the courtrooms and it's safe, how many litigators will be interested in doing virtual trials, for example? Depositions may be different, although there's still, I think, a strong view in the world of litigators that they're not as good as actual depositions, which I don't particularly share the view of, but I hear that.
Steve, on the depositions, I hear the same thing from litigators, but more and more from the clients who pay for those litigators, not going to fund them. Mm-hmm. So when you think, is it as good? Maybe not. Is it good enough? Probably.
Yeah. Plus there's all the, sorry, go ahead.
It is. And I've always said that's, where true innovation will come is when the clients sort of say this, no more, we're not going to do it this way anymore. So that'll be interesting, particularly in the insurance world. I can certainly see carriers saying we're going to pay for this. We're not going to pay for this kind of stuff anymore. But then, of course, you get into this, sort of responsibility of a lawyer hired by a carrier to the real client at the insured. And, could very easily say, well, this is detracting from my ability to represent my client, and I have to take a deposition. And that's a strong leverage point. The other thing I thought about when you were talking, Molly, was another story I saw, which was a story about an MDL judge in, I believe, Georgia or South Carolina. And if you know how that works, there's always this very bitter fight over who will be the lead MDL lawyers. And this federal judge said, okay, we're going to have a diverse group of MDL lawyers that represent these people. And she did it. They have several women, several people of color. And I was thinking, in terms of when you said clients are going to force it, we also maybe see that with judges who are going to say, you guys all had your chance to do something about this non-diverse situation that we have in law. And if you don't do it, we will. So, maybe that's a reason for optimism. So sorry, Bob, I got us all off track.
Yeah, no, well, I wonder whether we should have Victoria just kind of summarize her story, because it's very related to what you're talking about. And then we can come back to the discussion. But
Yeah, I wrote an article earlier this week about kind of like a follow-up from an article from a couple months ago about like courts across the country, state governments across the country, they're facing budget cuts, and some of those state governors have mentioned like specifically making significant cuts to their court systems. And I reached out to some of those affected court systems to ask, could, video conferencing and that type of technology be at stake, or, could that potentially be on the chopping block? And they said when it comes to technology, video conferencing technology would be the last thing they would cut, because that's what they need to kind of keep the doors open, especially with COVID-19 concerns from staffers, judges, litigants, the public, but still providing those services, but remotely. And I reached out last week to some of those court systems about, okay, you implemented video conferencing tech. Are you guys looking at any additional technology or processes, to deal with potential case backlogs during COVID-19 shutdowns, or, lingering health concerns with some people maybe don't want to come into the courts for some legal matters. And it was kind of split around, like some people, a lot of court systems, a few of them, they said they did implement some maybe plexiglass and, separating people during jury trials or just waiting for their matters, those types of things. But when it came to technology, some of them, like in California, they said, oh, we already gave these suggestions about, providing digital services and, providing checklists for how to do some legal matters online to kind of simplify when people actually do come to the courthouse, to have all the paperwork and documents that they need to kind of like simplify those types of services. But in Georgia, it was interesting because they did put together some video conferencing software specifically to start using Zoom. But when I spoke to them, they said they also wanted to implement like a digital evidence sharing platform, but they weren't able to find the funds for it. So that was something that they said, hey, this could be useful beyond just COVID-19. It will make things more efficient, more safer. But they couldn't find the funding for it because, Georgia did face some staffing cuts. And I think they even said they tried to see if they can get some money from the COVID-19 government funding, but that money went towards more PPE and they couldn't get any for technology. And I think to what Nikki and Steve and Molly were saying, like it really, tech innovation in courts, I think they have to have the funds for tech innovation to actually occur. If they don't have kind of like, taxpayer dollars or someone willing to fund these initiatives, it won't happen. Even if you have some court systems that say like, hey, this would be really useful even beyond COVID-19. It really hinges on funding. And with like kind of states not having as much revenue, I don't know if we'll see it necessarily, courts really looking any different from like pre-2019.
Yeah, I wonder I don't know if any of you were on that, the ABA Women in Legal Tech, Women of Legal Tech Summit that was held this week. It was a 2-day program from the Legal Technology Resource Center. But one of the most interesting programs they had was 3 judges from LA, was it the LA County Courts or something, which is apparently the largest trial court system in the country. And the 3 judges were all members of the technology committee for that court system. And I thought it was really interesting because they talked a lot about steps they had been taking to adopt, make greater use of technology in advance of COVID, but how COVID, like we've all heard, accelerated the need to get that technology working and up to speed. The one funny thing I thought is somebody at the Q&A session at the end, somebody kind of asked them about how are you getting the budget for all of this? And they sort of didn't flinch at that. It wasn't like this was they didn't make it sound like this was an out of the ordinary expenditure, that this was just, part of how they were allocating the court budget, and it was within the parameters. The way I understood it, anyway, it was just within the parameters of the court budget to do this. But they had really, and also the other thing that was interesting about it is a lot of the technology they talked about, or at least showed, it reminded me of Judge Schlegel in New Orleans, because a lot of it is kind of off the shelf stuff that, not necessarily something custom built for courtrooms or whatever else. But I don't know if that's taped at all, but anybody's interested in this topic might want to see if they could find that presentation from those 3 judges, because it was really, really interesting.
Bob, it's interesting that California, even though I think they had they did have a court budget cut, but they also received the court system. They received like 25 million for court technology specifically. I was like, that's something that you read about, like a lot of other states were able to kind of have that fund. And speaking to an official in California, and he was like, okay, yeah, of course, some courts systems and counties that they're in, they may be facing different types of need. But he said, like, they do have that technology grant to kind of like, if they need to implement, they have that access. A lot of other states don't. And I know Georgia was one of those. It's kind of like we couldn't find the money for it. So it does kind of vary based on the jurisdiction and kind of like where can they find the money?
Yeah. So California's state tax revenue is actually up over 2020 was up over 2019, which most states didn't have this luxury, but California, I don't know what it is. I assume because people from colder states relocated there or something, but they have more money now, so hopefully no more cuts.
One thing I'd wanted to point out about the virtual court appearances versus trials or hearings. What I've heard from judges that I've spoken to locally is that it's the appearances that they're really gung-ho on. It saved them a ton of time, made their dockets way more efficient, and they really love this idea of having virtual court appearances, meaning when you just show up and either in a criminal case or a civil litigation matter, and it's just a short appearance where you're reporting on the status or providing an update. And for busy, especially criminal defense attorneys who spend their mornings hopping from court to court, and then what slows the courts down is they call the defense attorney's name or the client's name, and they're off in another court because they waited so long and they got called into that court. And so when you can have people appearing virtually, you don't have to have people running around the courts the entire morning. So I think that you may see the more routine types of appearances still being done virtually if the parties agree to it versus hearings and trials, which are often and depositions, which are far more difficult from a litigator's perspective.
Yeah, and I think that's for sure in the civil space, and even in the criminal justice space. I'll just throw out, because it's been a couple weeks, I wrote about the kiosk system that St. Louis created for their North County. They now have a kiosk court because they realized during the pandemic that there were we've talked about this a little bit, definite equity issues with bandwidth and making appearances for low-income residents, and especially from the North County area. So they established a kiosk system. They already had a way for people to come into the court, they were initially calling it a Zoom garden, and have little spots that you could go make your appearance. And then they decided to go ahead and create an outpost in North County. So I think that there's probably going to be somewhat of a hybrid. I mean, there's an expense in that, but then, take away from the time and the commitment of having a fully staffed bench for appearances. And I'm hoping that we'll see some money shift.
You did say Zoom garden, right?
That ultimately, we would see the advantages of that, and it would lead to more substantive hearings being done online. It may never have the company trial that was done virtually, but there are lots of trials that don't happen, frankly, because of the expense and the unfairness of everybody having to go to the courthouse and sitting through a trial and all the time and disruption and all of that. And there'd be some real advantages to being able to do some of that virtually, both for the litigants and the jurors and the witnesses and everybody else involved. But like most of you, I'm not sure we're going to see that anytime soon. But I do think the appearances, California and other states for years have had appearances via telephone. Why never dawned on somebody to say, you don't have to be here by phone. You could be here, by video chat would be, but nobody, it never dawned on anybody that that was a possibility, I guess. So that, that's not much of a step to go to kind of virtual sort of hearings that would do away with a lot of the motion hour inefficiencies that we've seen over the years.
I did want to bring up a point about Steve's original article that he talked about with Ropes and Gray. I mean, I guess the way the article was phrased was that it's probably like a memo that got sent around, and then a reporter got a hold of it somehow. So who knows? Maybe it's just them. Maybe other firms have done the same thing, or released similar memos that just haven't been leaked to the press or whatnot. But I mean, one thing that we've been talking about is or wondering is whether or not things are going to go back to normal after the pandemic is over, and like, is it going to be like a more hybrid kind of thing where you have more people kind of working at home and not coming to the office as much? But it seems like at least this firm doesn't want that. And I mean, just I haven't reported on Ropes and Gray in a long time. Like I did a couple of profiles of people there or whatnot back when I worked at ALM, and I know that they've always been very, very like. I mean, all firms are very protective of their culture. All firms think that their culture is the best. But I felt like Ropes and Gray, like they especially wanted to get that point across, that their culture was awesome, and that everyone loved it there, and that they had this like really special kind of connection with everybody there. So maybe they felt like something was missing by having everybody online and not being in the office, that they didn't have that same kind of office culture. Or who knows, maybe they just want everybody back in their offices so that they can keep tabs on people and whatnot. So I mean, I thought that was interesting. Just the just that memo coming out, and B, that it was that firm that got publicized.
What I'm starting to hear from trainers in particular at law firms is that they're having a really hard time with the spontaneous opportunities for associates to learn by being pulled into an office or pulled onto a call, or just sit in the back, and all of that is missing, and the opportunities are hard to recreate in a virtual environment. So kind of when we were talking about pipeline issues too, trying to mentor and train the next generation is a challenge still in a remote environment, or especially.
And I hear you, Molly. I have kind of strong opinions on that, because that was sort of the traditional model, that you will go and sit at the foot of the partner and derive this knowledge from on high. Of course, the problem with that is could be very happenstance, right? I mean, I was fortunate enough to latch on to a partner who was meaner than a snake, but on the other hand, taught me a lot of things, and other people don't have that opportunity. And I had hoped that when we started thinking about the training of associates in the age of COVID and remote, that it would maybe force firms to sit down and say, what does it mean to be a good lawyer? Let's define it, and then let's put together a consistent training program toward that end, instead of this, I bumped into partner A at the water cooler and she said, you ought to try this or that or the other. And query how much of that really goes on. I mean, in particularly in large law firms where there's so much of a pressure, both for partners and associates, to be billing their time, not chit-chatting at the water cooler. As valuable as that is, I mean, I don't mean to suggest it's not valuable, but sometimes I think law firms have put too much stock in that and not enough emphasis on what does it really mean and what are we really training toward in a comprehensive way.
Yeah. I mean, there's no reason the hybrid model can't work for even training in that vein. I've also just as much heard some associates say that they've had more FaceTime with partners than during the Zoom era than they would have otherwise had. So it can work both ways. And I don't know whether I actually said this about ILTA, but ILTA will be a hybrid conference and not just an in-person conference. And I still think, despite what the Ropes and Gray story may be suggesting, that that's generally going to be the model going forward, is some kind of a hybrid blend of what we used to have and what we've had for the last year, and mixing it together in some kind of a hybrid form.